What if the only thing you ever inherited in your life wasn't money or a house, but a patch of dying forest, and a rumor that somewhere beneath its roots lay enough stolen gold to change your fate forever? And what if that forest wasn't just land on a piece of paper, but something alive, something that watched you, chose you, and was willing to kill to protect you? In a country where millions of people work 2, even 3 jobs and still can't keep the lights on. Imagine being a single mom standing at the pharmacy counter, holding your son's inhaler prescription in one hand and an overdrafted debit card in the other, knowing you can only choose between his breath and this month's rent. Tonight's story begins exactly, oh Joe, with Mara Ellis, a woman who is more exhausted than she is afraid, a woman so deep in the working poor spiral that hope feels like a luxury item. She's not a hero. She's not special by any normal measure. She's just like so many people you and I pass every day, running on black coffee, unpaid bills, and the thin hope that tomorrow might hurt a little bit less, until a letter from a dead stranger lands in her mailbox and drags her into a hidden world under the Appalachian Mountains, a world of root-carved rooms, glowing amber light, blood-stained gold, and a living house that remembers every crime ever committed against the land above it. This is not a story about getting rich overnight. It's a story about what happens when wealth has a body count, when the earth itself decides it's done letting people steal from it, and when one broke, stubborn mother is forced to choose between saving her child and healing a wound that started generations before she was born. So, if you've ever wondered what you would do if life handed you a miracle with a curse attached, if you've ever felt like the system was rigged and the land was tired of being silent, stay with me, because we're about to step into the dark below the roots, and nothing that comes back up will be the same. Most people think rock bottom is a single moment, one bad choice, one hospital bill, one pink slip. But for Mara Ellis, rock bottom was a long, grinding slope, the kind that wears you down grain by grain until you don't recognize the person staring back at you in the bathroom mirror at 5 in the morning. Her day always began before the sun and long before her energy. She'd splash cold water on her face, stare at the dark circles that felt permanent, and whisper the same promise she'd made every morning for the last 3 years. Just get through today. But even that wasn't a guarantee anymore. The truth is, millions of Americans know exactly what Mara's life looked like, working 2 jobs, sometimes 3, and still coming up short. Statistically, nearly 38 million people in the U.S. live below the poverty line. But that number doesn't include the working poor, the people like Mara, who technically make too much to qualify for assistance, while still skipping meals to feed their kids. It's a miracle she managed to keep a roof over their heads, even if it was a moldy 2-room rental with a heater that rattled like it was coughing up its last breath. Her mornings started at the nursing home, where the pay was barely above minimum wage, but the work felt like it cost years of her life. Lifting patients twice her size, cleaning rooms, hauling linens, her back had given out so many times she'd lost count. The second job was a night shift at the gas station off Route 11, the kind where you stand behind the bulletproof window and hope no one mistakes you for a target. That was the shift where she'd wrap her hands around a styrofoam cup of burnt coffee because it was the only warmth she could afford. She'd watch truckers come and go while the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like a swarm of mechanical bees, and she'd try to ignore the ache in her feet from 12 straight hours on them. But the moment that broke her wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was quiet, almost invisible. Her son's inhaler prescription went up by $43 overnight. Not because the medicine changed, but because the insurance company decided it could. Mara stood at the pharmacy counter, the pharmacist's gentle voice filling the space like soft static, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. She looked at the total and realized her checking account wasn't just empty. It was negative. Again, she could either buy the inhaler or pay the electric bill. She couldn't do both. It's the kind of decision people write think pieces about, but rarely feel in their bones. For Mara, it was her daily reality. She chose the inhaler. She always chose her son. And that meant they ate ramen for a week while she prayed the lights would stay on long enough to get her next paycheck. There were nights when she sat on the edge of her bed, rubbing the ache in her shoulders, wondering if life was punishing her for mistakes she didn't even remember making. Nights when she'd watch her son sleep with the inhaler beside him, terrified of the sound of wheezing in the dark. Nights when she'd open past due envelopes with hands that trembled more from exhaustion than fear. The working poor spiral doesn't just drain your bank account, it drains your hope. It convinces you that survival is the best you can ever reach, that dreaming is a luxury meant for other people. But even in that exhaustion, there was a lesson quietly forming inside her. Sometimes, the people who look the most defeated are the ones standing on the edge of the most extraordinary turning points. Mara didn't know it yet, but her life was already shifting, quietly, like a tectonic plate deep underground, preparing to crack the surface. That's how transformation works, not loud, not heroic, just a tiny fracture in an unbearable routine. And Mara's fracture came in the form of a cream-colored envelope waiting in her mailbox the next morning, one she almost threw away because it looked like another overdue bill. A letter from someone she didn't know, a man she didn't remember, and an inheritance that would drag her into a world she never knew existed. There's a moment in every long struggle when exhaustion stops being something you carry and becomes something that carries you. For Mara Ellis, that moment came slowly, like water rising under a door. Unnoticed at first, then suddenly everywhere at once. It wasn't that her life got worse overnight. It was that everything she'd been holding together with tape, prayer, and stubbornness had finally begun to split apart at the seams. And the strange thing is, breaking points rarely look like explosions. Sometimes they look painfully ordinary. It started with her car, not a new problem. Her old Civic had been clunking for months. But this time, the sound was different. A metal on metal grinding like the car was screaming. The mechanic at the local shop didn't sugarcoat anything. Your transmission's dying. You're looking at least $1,800. He said it casually, like people carried that kind of money inside their wallets. Mara nodded as if she could handle it, but as she sat back inside the car, the number spun in her head like a roulette wheel that always landed on lose. That wasn't all. Her landlord taped a notice to her door that week. Rent was increasing by $150 next month because property taxes went up. In reality, the man just wanted to keep up with the rising market. It was the kind of increase that looks small on paper, but feels catastrophic when your budget is already stretched thinner than the soles of your sneakers. And then came the email from the school nurse, a reminder that her son Liam's asthma was getting worse and he needed to avoid cold mornings. But she couldn't afford to skip her 5 a.m. shift or call out without risking being replaced. Poverty doesn't pause for sick days. The thing is, Americans don't often talk about the cost of being poor, the literal cost. Studies show that low-income families pay nearly 4 times more in fees, penalties, high-interest loans, and unexpected emergencies than middle-income households. Poverty charges interest. Poverty punishes the tired. Poverty multiplies every small crisis into a disaster. And for Mara, it wasn't one disaster. It was 5 tiny ones, piling up until she felt her chest tightening every time her phone buzzed. One night at the gas station, around 2 a.m., a customer got angry when the card reader wouldn't work. He slammed his fist against the glass and shouted that she was useless. And for a moment, she truly believed him. She went home and cried silently in the shower so Liam wouldn't hear. Crying in a shower is a working poor classic. The sound of the water hides the sound of breaking. She leaned her head against the tile and wondered if this was all she'd ever be. A woman failing in slow motion. But the actual breaking point came 3 nights later, and it wasn't loud or dramatic. She slipped on a patch of ice behind the nursing home while taking out a trash bag, and her knee buckled under her. She lay there on the cold ground, feeling the burn of pain shooting up her leg, staring at the night sky like it might hold an answer. Nobody saw her fall. Nobody came out to help. She crawled to the railing, pulled herself up, and limped inside to finish her shift. Because when you're poor, you don't stop. You don't rest. You endure. That night, after putting Liam to bed, she finally allowed herself to whisper the truth she'd been avoiding. I can't keep going like this. It wasn't a dramatic declaration, just a tired mother admitting defeat to an empty room. But strangely, that admission felt like both a wound and a release, because sometimes your lowest moment isn't the end of the story. Sometimes it's the doorway. And in that breath of hopeless honesty, she felt something shift inside her, like she'd been pushed so far down she could only go forward. The lesson that grew from that moment wasn't loud or bold or even comforting. It was simple. People don't break because they're weak. They break because they've been strong for too long with too little support. And sometimes the universe doesn't send help. It sends a catalyst, something so unexpected it feels like a glitch in reality. Mara didn't know it yet, but her catalyst was already on its way. Because the next morning, limping and exhausted, she opened her mailbox and found it, the cream-colored envelope that would upend everything she thought she knew about struggle, survival, and the hidden places where hope can take root. The envelope didn't look like a miracle. It didn't glow or hum or slide out of the mailbox with a dramatic gust of wind. It was just cream-colored, thick, a little wrinkled from the cold morning air, the kind of envelope used by lawyers or wealthy people, 2 categories Mara Ellis had never belonged to. She almost threw it into the deal with later pile she kept on the kitchen counter, a sad little mountain of overdue bills, shut-off warnings, and medical reminders she tried to face only when absolutely necessary. But something about the weight of the envelope made her pause. It felt heavier than paper should feel, as if the contents carried a burden rather than information. She stood at the sink, hands trembling slightly, not with excitement, but exhaustion, and tore the seal open with her thumb. The letter slid out smoothly, embossed with the formal heading, Rutherford and Hale, attorneys at law, Charleston, West Virginia. That alone made her stomach tighten. Lawyers didn't send good news, not to people like her. She read the first line once, then twice, then a third time, because her brain refused to process it. You are the sole beneficiary of the estate of Mr. Samuel H. Rourke. For a moment, her mind simply blanked. The name meant nothing. She didn't know a Samuel Rourke. She flipped the page over, checking if there had been some mistake. But the next paragraph confirmed it. He was her mother's uncle, a great uncle she barely remembered, a man who had lived like a rumor, mentioned once or twice in hushed tones, always described as strange, not all there, or one of those mountain hermits you shouldn't disturb. The letter explained that he had passed away 2 weeks earlier at the age of 92, leaving behind a piece of property in the Appalachian foothills, 32 acres of forested land, and whatever structures stood upon it. Inheritance, land, property, words that didn't belong in her world. Her first reaction wasn't joy. It was suspicion, because for people who live paycheck to paycheck, good news doesn't fall from the sky. It usually hides a trap. Taxes, legal fees, some kind of scam. She reread the section explaining that the property taxes had already been prepaid through the next 3 years. There were no outstanding debts, no liens, no conditions except one. Visit the property in person when able. A map is enclosed. She reached back into the envelope and unfolded a piece of thick, yellowing parchment, a hand-drawn map. Her heart thudded as she traced the ink lines, an old mining road, a stream, and a location marked with an X and a handwritten note, the root dwelling. The name hit her with a strange sense of déjà vu, like something she'd overheard as a child. Her mother had mentioned Samuel once, maybe twice. A war veteran who came home broken in ways nobody could name, who refused to live in town, who spent decades carving and building something deep in the woods, something people whispered about, but never confirmed. Some said it was a bunker, some said it was a shelter, some said it was madness made physical. For the first time in years, Mara felt something unfamiliar, curiosity that wasn't immediately crushed by fear. She sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd cried over bills and rationed groceries, and forced herself to breathe. She read the letter again, slower this time, tracing the legal language with her finger. Her hands shook, not from hope, but from the dizzy possibility that the universe was finally giving her something other than pain. But the practical part of her brain kicked in immediately. Inheritance didn't solve everything. She couldn't sell land sight unseen. She didn't know what condition it was in. Could be worthless, could be dangerous. And 32 acres sounded less like a gift and more like a responsibility she couldn't afford. Still, what if it wasn't worthless? What if there was something there she could use, fix, sell, anything that might pull her out of the pit she'd been clawing through for years? She reached for her laptop and searched Inheritance Taxes, Appalachia, Property Scams, West Virginia. What to do when you inherit land. The results were overwhelming and not exactly comforting. Legal jargon, warnings about environmental liabilities, stories of abandoned mines and unsafe structures, but buried among the noise was one recurring truth. Land is one of the few things that rarely loses value. The more she read, the more a strange thought took shape. Half hope, half desperation. Maybe this is my way out. But then another thought hit her harder. If she could earn even a small amount of money from the land, she could finally get Liam the medical equipment he needed. She could fix the car. She could breathe for the first time in a decade. As the morning sun filtered through the thin curtains, painting faint gold across her kitchen table, she realized something unexpected. The letter hadn't lifted her burdens. It had illuminated just how heavy those burdens had become, because hope, even tiny hope, is dangerous. It makes you imagine alternatives, choices, futures. She folded the map carefully, smoothing the creases as if it were fragile. Her heart thumped in a way she hadn't felt since she was a girl, before life taught her not to expect anything good to last. Something about the name Root Dwelling gnawed at the back of her mind, like a whisper she couldn't place. A name that felt less like a location and more like an invitation. She stood, grabbed her keys, and looked toward Liam's room where he was still asleep, curled like a small question mark beneath his blanket. This wasn't just about her. It never had been. It was about giving him a future she'd never been allowed to imagine for herself. So she took one last look at the envelope, inhaled deeply, and whispered the same words her mother used to say whenever life forced them onto uncertain paths. If it came to you, maybe it's because you're meant to follow it. And with that, Mara made the decision that would unravel everything she thought she knew about family, history, and the land itself. She didn't realize it yet, but the moment she grabbed that map, she had already stepped into a story that began long before she was born, one that pulsed beneath the soil like an old heartbeat, waiting to be heard again. The road leading toward Samuel Rourke's land wasn't the kind of road built for regular people. It was the kind that disappeared from GPS halfway through the trip, replaced by a blinking gray square and the mocking phrase, "No service." The forest swallowed the sky the deeper Mara drove, the trees rising like ancient watchmen whose patience had worn thin long before she was born. The pavement cracked, then crumbled, then vanished entirely, leaving only a dirt path carved by tires older than her car. Liam sat in the back seat, his inhaler hanging from a string around his neck like a protective charm, watching the world outside with wide eyes. Not fear, not excitement, but something quiet and heavy, as if he could feel the forest watching back. The Appalachian mountains are old, older than the Rockies, older than the desert mesas, older than most languages spoken in this country. Scientists say they're over 480 million years old, worn down from once being taller than the Himalayas. But people who grew up in these hollows will tell you something different, that the mountains remember things, that every ridge, every stream, every pocket of moss carries stories inside it. Some of those stories are beautiful, some are violent, and some simply refuse to die. Mara had heard these sayings as a child, but never believed them. Yet, as her car rattled over a patch of exposed roots, she couldn't shake the feeling that the terrain wasn't just rough. It was warning her. The trees grew so close to the road that their branches arched overhead, stitching together a natural tunnel. The air changed, too, thickening with a cool scent of soil and something faintly sweet, like sap or resin. When she rolled the windows down, the forest breathed in, and the sound was unsettlingly human, like a long, slow inhale. She shook it off as imagination, but imagination didn't explain why every hair on her arms stood up. After nearly an hour of navigating the narrowing trail, she reached the property line. No fence, no gate, just a rusted metal sign half buried in vines. Rourke, no trespass. The irony almost made her laugh. Trespassing on land she supposedly owned. Her boots sank into soft earth as she stepped out, and the silence wrapped around her like a heavy coat. Not the peaceful kind. This was the silence of a place too far removed from civilization to care about visitors. She took out the parchment map, holding it against the wind. The hand-drawn ink showed a stream, then a curve in the ridge, then a symbol shaped like a spiral. She followed the markings, pushing through brush and stepping over rotting logs. Liam stayed close, clutching her sleeve. The deeper they walked, the stranger it became. There were markings on the trees, not carved, but grown. Patterns in the bark that resembled fingerprints, spiraling around the trunks. Fungi shaped like little cups, filled with amber liquid. Rocks arranged in a loose circle as if someone had been trying to remember an ancient ritual but couldn't quite finish it. Birds didn't chirp here. No crickets, no wind. The forest wasn't empty. It was listening. The first undeniable sign that something was wrong, or right, depending on how you see it, came when they reached the stream. The water was clear, but beneath the surface lay dozens of smooth stones, each one covered in thin, hair-like roots that swayed without any current. Liam knelt, fascinated. Mara wanted to pull him back, but the roots didn't move toward him. In fact, when he dipped his hand in, the roots shifted away, like seagrass avoiding a passing fish. It was subtle, almost gentle, but unmistakable. She felt a tightening in her throat. Biology couldn't explain that. At least, not in any way she understood. Still, she pressed forward, reminding herself that people often misinterpret natural phenomena as mystical. That's what she told herself. But some part of her, an older part, buried under years of exhaustion and practicality, felt something ancient pressing back from beneath the soil. When they finally reached the ridge curve shown on the map, Mara froze. The trail dead-ended at a massive fallen oak, not just big, colossal, nearly 10 feet thick, split open down the middle like a cracked ribcage. Moss coated the bark in a vibrant green, but something else glimmered beneath it. Resin. Thick, honey-colored resin that pulsed with faint light, as if catching some invisible sunbeam. She stepped closer and noticed that the inner wood, normally pale, was streaked with reddish veins, almost like dried blood. The forest had grown around the fallen tree, not over it, as if protecting it, or guarding something beneath. She checked the map again. The X was right here, and that strange handwritten note. Root dwelling. But there was no house, no cabin, no structure, just a massive, ancient corpse of a tree. For a moment she felt foolish. Had her uncle been delusional? Had the lawyers misled her? Was this whole thing nothing more than 32 acres of useless land in the middle of nowhere? Then Liam whispered, "Mom, look." At the base of the fallen oak, hidden under a curtain of moss and gnarled roots, was a shape she almost missed, the faint outline of a door made of root and bark, woven together so seamlessly it looked grown rather than built. No hinges, no handle, just a spiral pattern at its center, the same spiral drawn on the map. Mara reached out, her hand hovering over the living wood. It felt warm, not room temperature warm, warm like skin. She yanked her hand back, heart hammering. Fear should have sent her running. Logic should have told her to turn around, get back in her car, call the lawyer, and pretend she'd never seen any of this. But life had already backed her into a corner so tight she no longer had the luxury of fear. Sometimes the next step forward is the only step left. Sometimes the only way out is through. And maybe that's the quiet lesson buried inside this moment, the kind of truth that lives only in places far from witnesses. When life breaks you enough times, the unknown becomes less frightening than the familiar. Sometimes stepping into danger is easier than staying in despair. Liam tugged her sleeve gently, eyes wide but trusting. "Maybe it's supposed to be us," he said, and his voice carried a strange certainty, like a child repeating something he didn't realize he'd heard. Mara took a breath, placed her palm on the warm, spiraled wood, and the door exhaled. A soft vibration rippled through the roots, and the living wood twisted open, revealing a dark passage that descended into the earth, a place carved not by man, but by time, intention, and something far older than her family name. She stepped forward, carrying her son, her exhaustion, her desperation, and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, this strange inheritance wasn't a burden, but the beginning of a path she was meant to walk. The passage didn't feel dug or carved. It felt grown. The walls weren't dirt or stone, but thick, braided roots that curved like the ribs of some ancient creature. They twisted together so tightly there wasn't a single crack to let air pass through. Yet the space didn't feel suffocating. It felt alive. As Mara stepped deeper into the corridor, amber droplets embedded in the roots cast a soft golden glow, like lanterns fueled by captured sunlight. The scent of resin thickened, warm and strangely comforting, almost like the smell of pine needles after summer rain. Liam held her hand, quiet, his eyes reflecting the amber light like two tiny orbs. The ground sloped downward, and just as Mara wondered how far the tunnel went, the roots widened into an open chamber. Her breath caught. She had never seen anything like it. No photo, no documentary, no museum display came close. The room was a perfect circle about 30 feet wide, with a ceiling shaped like a dome of interlocking roots that met at a central knot, glowing faintly from within. Slabs of polished wood, smooth as stone, formed benches around the room, their surfaces shaped naturally, not cut. It was a space that felt both sacred and functional, like a chapel carved by nature instead of human hands. At the chamber's center stood a wooden table, not assembled with nails or joints, but grown from the floor as though the roots had pushed upward and blossomed into furniture. On top of it lay a single object, a leather-bound book, old and cracked at the spine. Mara hesitated to touch it, but Liam, curious and fearless in the way children sometimes are, brushed the cover lightly. The roots along the walls responded with a faint hum, as if acknowledging his presence. Mara opened the book, and dust rose like a ghost, exhaling. Inside were pages filled with Samuel Rourke's handwriting, tight, angular, deliberate. His entries weren't the ramblings of a hermit, as she'd been led to believe. They were precise records, layered with observation, memory, and something like confession. One line repeated often, almost like a mantra. The earth remembers. We forget. She read pieces aloud, her voice echoing softly how Samuel had returned from war carrying wounds that medicine couldn't treat, how the noise of towns made his bones rattle, how he found solace among the trees, trees older than any man, trees that carried wisdom without speaking it. His writing documented decades living underground, where he claimed the forest guided him through dreams and instinct, teaching him to shape the roots without harming the tree that once stood above. There were diagrams, too, intricate sketches of root systems, hollowed tunnels, measurements, notes on airflow, humidity, and growth patterns. He had built this place slowly, tenderly, like someone stitching a wound closed. But among the technical notes were darker observations, warnings about trespassers, men he claimed were blood-warm, with greed, searching the land for something they believed he stole. Mara frowned at that part, but kept reading. On one page, the handwriting changed, shakier, uneven. The forest does not hate, it protects, and when threatened, it removes the threat. I have only been its witness. There were accounts of people who entered the woods with violence in their hearts and never returned, not because Samuel harmed them, he insisted, but because the forest took them back. He wrote about roots tightening around ankles, pathways shifting, sounds leading intruders astray. The entries bordered between folklore and warning, but the sincerity in his handwriting made the air in the chamber feel colder. Liam pressed his ear to the wall, then looked up. "It's breathing," he whispered. Mara dropped to her knees and listened. He wasn't wrong. A soft, rhythmic vibration pulsed through the roots, slow and steady, like a heartbeat deep beneath the soil. She backed away, unnerved. It would have been easy to call it imagination, to explain the pulse as wind or underground water, but the forest above had been silent. No wind, no birds, no nothing, and the timing of the vibration aligned almost perfectly with her own pulse, like the house was syncing itself to her presence. She moved deeper, exploring the connected chambers. Each served a different purpose. One held tools, carved from wood, but sharpened, like iron. Another stored dried herbs, bundled with twine, labeled in Samuel's handwriting, for fever, for pain, for clarity. A third chamber appeared to be a sleeping area lined with soft moss and woven bark blankets. Everything was crafted with an intention that made the space feel less like a shelter and more like a sanctuary. But the final room, tucked farthest from the entrance, was different. It was much smaller, barely big enough for two people to stand inside. The ceiling lowered, and the walls curved inward, forming a space that resembled the inside of a seed. At the center was a pedestal, grown directly from the floor, holding nothing but a hollow depression shaped like a cupped hand. Above it, carved into the wood, were the words, "What is taken must one day be returned." For a long moment, Mara simply stared. She didn't know what had once rested there, but whatever it was, it mattered. Then she noticed something odd. The temperature of the room. It was warmer here, as if the roots beneath the pedestal still held something alive, something waiting. She reached out, but before her fingers touched the wood, Liam grabbed her wrist. His voice trembled. "Mom, don't. There's a particular kind of fear that doesn't shout. It whispers, and in that whisper is truth." She pulled her hand back slowly. At that moment, Mara understood something she hadn't been able to articulate until now. This place wasn't abandoned. It wasn't forgotten. It wasn't even empty. Samuel hadn't built a house. He had grown. A living system, half refuge, half organism, part architecture, part memory. and somehow, impossibly, it had accepted her presence. The lesson she felt nesting quietly in her chest wasn't about magic or folklore. It was about listening, something she hadn't had the space, the time, or the luxury to do for years. Listening to her own exhaustion, listening to the land beneath her, listening to the idea that maybe not everything in her life had to be fought. Some things, just maybe, could help her carry the weight. But she also sensed the other side of that truth. If a place can welcome, it can reject. If it can shield, it can defend. And Samuel's journals suggested the forest's judgment wasn't random. Mara closed the book, her pulse steady and slow, mirroring the gentle thrum in the walls. For the first time in a long time, she felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, not hope, but alignment, as if something deep underground had shifted slightly to make room for her. She didn't know yet what she would find next. She didn't know the magnitude of the secrets rooted beneath her feet. But when she turned back toward the tunnel, leading deeper into the dwelling, she no longer felt like she was trespassing. She felt like she was being led. The deeper Mara moved into the root dwelling, the more the air thickened, not with dust or decay, but with something that felt like expectation. The forest seemed to be holding its breath. The amber glow along the walls brightened as she descended a narrow passageway that veered sharply downward, as if the roots themselves were guiding her towards something they had guarded for decades. Liam stayed close, gripping her jacket, his small footsteps echoing faintly behind hers. Even he didn't speak now. Some places make children quiet, not out of fear, but reverence. The passage ended at a chamber unlike the others. This one felt older, much older. The roots along the walls were gnarled, thicker, twisted upon themselves, in a pattern so intricate it resembled ancient calligraphy. The ceiling arched into a dome of wooden ribs, and at the far end stood a structure that didn't belong in a forest at all, a rectangular vault embedded into the floor, framed by living wood that had grown around it like protective hands cradling a wound. It wasn't metal or stone. It was made of dark, dense timber, polished smooth by time. At the center lay a panel with a carved spiral, the same pattern etched on Samuel's map, and the door they had entered through. Mara knelt, tracing it with her fingers. The moment her skin brushed the groove, the panel loosened with a soft, hollow click, almost like a sigh. The roots around the vault shifted, parting just enough to reveal a hidden compartment beneath. She swallowed hard and lifted the lid. What she saw inside stole her breath. Gold, bars of it, stacked neatly in rows, each one stamped with United States Treasury markings from the early 1930s. The metal glowed even in the dim amber light, heavy, solid, unmistakable. Some bars were perfect, polished. Others were scarred, pitted, bearing dark stains like burns or dried blood. She touched one cautiously, and it weighed more than she expected, roughly 27 ounces, worth tens of thousands of dollars each. Her entire life, every bill, every medical crisis, every anxiety attack at the grocery store could be erased with one of these bars. Just one. Mara stared, dizzy. Her chest tightened with a strange cocktail of awe and terror. This wasn't the kind of inheritance people received accidentally. Gold like this had history, a violent history, the kind connected to bootleggers, mobsters, mining companies that buried their sins under dead workers and forged paperwork. She flipped through more of Samuel's journals, now stacked neatly beside the vault. Pages filled with confession, guilt, warnings. He wrote about the Darrow Mining Syndicate, a company notorious in the 1920s and 30s for exploiting Appalachian laborers, paying them starvation wages, and burying workplace deaths under falsified reports. This gold, Samuel said, belonged to them. Gold stolen from blood wages, from illegal smuggling operations, from hush money paid to silence entire towns. He had taken it, not to keep, but to hide, to bury, to deny it from the hands that would only use it to hurt again. His words trembled with both shame and resolve. Wealth born of suffering cannot heal the world. It only infects it. What is stolen stays cursed unless it is redeemed. Mara felt the weight of those words settle into her bones. Poverty does something to a person. It makes you see money differently, not as luxury, but as oxygen. And yet, staring at the gold, she felt nothing like relief. She felt a coldness creeping into her chest. Human instinct whispered, "Take it." Her mother's voice whispered, "Be careful with gifts that come too easily." Her own fear whispered, "What if someone is looking for this? What if they already know?" Liam picked up a smaller bar, one of the older, scorched ones. "Why would Uncle Samuel hide something like this?" he asked. His voice echoed gently, too honest for the room. Mara didn't answer, because her mind wasn't on Samuel anymore. It was on the reality that people who lose millions of dollars don't just shrug and move on. Corporations don't forget. The greedy don't forgive. This gold didn't just represent wealth. It represented danger. She imagined walking into a pawn shop, holding one bar in her hand, paying the bills, fixing the car, buying groceries without doing math in her head. She imagined Liam breathing easy, sleeping without wheezing. She imagined a life without fear. Then she imagined being found, being hunted, being blamed for something Samuel did 70 years ago, being crushed between corporate greed and generational guilt. The truth hit her hard. She had inherited not wealth, but the responsibility for someone else's sin. That realization formed a quiet lesson, one she didn't want, but couldn't ignore. Some choices don't have right answers. Some choices only reveal the shape of who you are. And sometimes survival and morality collide so violently you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. She closed the vault slowly. Her hands shook, not from the physical weight of the gold, but the heaviness of knowing what it could do to her life, to her son, to her sanity. If she took the gold, she might save her family. If she kept it hidden, she might protect them. Either way, the moment she lifted that lid, her life stopped belonging only to her. Liam tugged her sleeve gently. "Mom, we shouldn't stay down here," he whispered, suddenly uneasy. And Mara realized he was right. The air had shifted. The hum in the walls grew low and tense, like a warning. She looked back at the map, the vault, the amber glow. She didn't know it yet, but this discovery had awakened more than memory. It had awakened interest. It had awakened danger. And somewhere in the world beyond the forest, some man in an office tower or a warehouse or a boardroom was already searching for what she had just found. Mara felt the shift before she heard it. The root dwelling, usually humming with a soft, steady pulse, fell silent, like a heartbeat, pausing mid-beat. Silence isn't always peace. Sometimes it's a warning. The amber resin lights dimmed to a deeper gold, and the roots along the walls tightened almost imperceptibly, as if the entire structure were inhaling and holding its breath. Liam clung to her arm. Even he sensed it. Children often feel danger before adults can name it. They climbed back toward the entrance chamber, the journals tucked into Mara's bag, and her thoughts spinning in circles. She tried to focus on Liam, on safety, on the immediate task of getting back to the car. But instinct clawed at her, an animal sense, telling her the forest no longer felt empty. She grabbed Liam's hand. "Stay close," she whispered. He didn't ask why. He just obeyed. When they emerged from the tunnel into the gray afternoon light, the forest greeted them with a subtle but undeniable change. Tracks, fresh ones, cut through the leaf litter. Heavy boots, multiple pairs. The impressions were sharp, recent, unsoftened by wind or time. Someone had followed them. Or worse, someone had arrived before them. Mara's breath caught in her throat. She knelt to touch one of the prints. The edges were still crisp. Liam tugged her sleeve. "Mom, we have to go." The crack of a twig echoed through the trees. Not the light snap of an animal, a deliberate weight. Human. They barely had time to turn when shadows moved between the trunks. 3 men, dressed in black utility gear, wearing earpieces and carrying more equipment than hikers would ever need. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. Their formation said everything. These were not explorers. These were hunters. One of them raised a hand. "Ms. Ellis," he called out, voice smooth, almost polite. "We're here on behalf of the Darrow Corporation. We believe you're in possession of property that belongs to us." Mara's stomach dropped. She backed toward the fallen oak. "I don't know what you're talking about." But the man smiled in a way that told her lies wouldn't save them. "Your uncle stole millions in assets from us. We're simply here to retrieve it." He glanced at Liam. "We'd prefer not to involve the boy. Fear is a strange thing, paralyzing and electrifying all at once." Mara grabbed Liam and bolted toward the only path she knew, back into the root dwelling. The hunters shouted for her to stop. One lunged forward, but the moment his foot crossed the mossy threshold of the oak, the forest reacted. The roots around the door trembled like a muscle twitching under skin. A low groan rose from deep underground. The chamber behind Mara vibrated. The hunters hesitated. The hesitation saved her. She pulled Liam through the doorway just as the roots sealed shut behind them, blending seamlessly into the wood, making the entrance vanish like it had never been there at all. Outside, fists pounded on the surface, but the door did not give. The forest had locked them in and locked the intruders out. For now. Mara spun around, clutching Liam to her chest. "We have to move," she whispered. The amber lights overhead flickered, brighter now, urgent. She followed the pulsing glow deeper into the dwelling, the chambers rumbling as if waking from a long slumber. The roots shifted underfoot, guiding them down a corridor that hadn't been there before. It was disorienting, like the dwelling was rewriting itself. Behind them, the pounding stopped, replaced by a deeper sound, a crack. Then another. The hunters were breaking through. The root dwelling trembled with a mixture of fury and fear. They reached the vault chamber just as a violent shudder ripped through the walls. The amber light strobed and the roots tightened like clenched fists. Mara turned to Liam, her voice steady, despite the panic rising inside her. "Whatever happens, don't let go of me." The door to the vault room exploded inward, roots snapping like dry bones. The first hunter stumbled through, weapon raised. He barely had time to look around before the forest reacted. A cluster of roots shot upward from the floor, looping around his ankles, wrist, torso, wrapping him in a cocoon of living wood. He screamed, the sound muffled as the roots tightened, pulling him downward into the soil, as if the earth itself were swallowing him whole. The scream cut off abruptly. Liam sobbed, burying his face in Mara's coat. She forced herself not to look away. Sometimes the truth of survival is ugly, and she needed to understand what this place would do to protect them. The second hunter entered with caution, aiming his weapon at the ceiling, scanning every corner. He shouted something into his earpiece, but static crackled back. No signal reached him here. The air grew heavier. The roots along the ceiling uncoiled silently, sliding down behind him like a predator easing toward prey. One brushed his shoulder. He spun, firing blindly. The bullets thudded uselessly into living wood. And then the roots struck, not violently, but with purpose, pulling him upward, wrapping tightly, silencing him. As the forest absorbed the threat, the dwelling shook harder now, more violently, as if the effort of defending itself came at a price. Cracks formed along the dome. Amber resin dripped from the ceiling like molten gold tears. Mara pulled Liam under the table, grown from the floor, shielding him with her own body. "It's okay," she whispered, hoping her voice could steady the trembling in both of them. "It's okay. We're going to get out. I promise." But part of her knew the dwelling was reaching its limit. Nature protects, but nature also breaks. And Samuel Rourke had warned in his journals. The dwelling will defend itself until it cannot. And when it cannot, it collapses to reclaim its secrets. The final hunter, a larger man with a scar down his jawline, entered, carrying a crowbar and a determination carved into his features. He didn't hesitate. He didn't fear superstition. He swung wildly at the roots, each hit echoing through the chamber. The dwelling convulsed in agony. The ceiling split, opening a fissure that showered the room in resin shards that glowed like falling stars. Then came the sound, deep, ancient, and unmistakably alive. A roar that wasn't made of breath, but of shifting earth. The floor under the hunter crumbled. Roots darted upward, striking like snakes. In seconds, he vanished into the earth below, pulled into the same unseen depth that had reclaimed the others. Silence returned, not peaceful, final. The dwelling gave one last shudder. The dome cracked completely. Chunks of root and resin fell as the ceiling sagged. The vault split open, spilling gold bars across the floor like a river of molten sunlight. Mara grabbed Liam and ran, not backward, but toward a narrow fissure opening along the side wall. Roots curled back, creating a path. The dwelling was giving them a way out. They climbed through the fissure just as the central chamber collapsed in a thunderous implosion. The ground shook so violently, Mara had to crawl, dragging Liam with her. The tunnel behind them caved in, sealing off the vault forever. Resin dust filled the air like golden mist. The pulse of the dwelling, usually calm, pounded erratically. When they finally emerged through a crack in the forest floor, several yards from the fallen oak, they collapsed onto the damp earth, gasping, shaking. Behind them, the forest shifted and settled, the ground swallowing the last of the root house in a slow, heavy exhale. It was gone. The hunters were gone. The vault was gone. Only the forest remained, silent, protective, uncompromising. And as Mara pulled Liam into her arms, trembling with adrenaline and grief, she understood something she hadn't grasped before. The forest wasn't punishing her. It wasn't saving her. It was protecting itself, its memory, its wounds, its secrets. She just happened to be standing inside those boundaries when the storm broke. The lesson pressed into her mind like a bruise. Some things in this world aren't meant to be owned. They're meant to be respected. And when greed tries to take what belongs to the earth will take back more than it loses. But as the dust settled, Mara realized something else, something colder, sharper, more terrifying. The hunters weren't the only ones who knew. They were just the first. Darrow's greed stretched far beyond 3 men, and the gold, no longer hidden, no longer safe, was now a story someone would come looking for. The morning after the root dwelling collapsed, the forest felt strangely light, as if it had exhaled a burden it had been holding for decades. But Mara and Liam didn't feel light at all. They felt hollow. Their clothes were coated in resin dust, their hands scraped raw from clawing their way out of the earth, and their minds still buzzing with the echoes of a place that no longer existed. As they reached the car, every muscle in Mara's body trembled, not from fear anymore, but from the kind of exhaustion that sits in your bones. She didn't look back. Some places aren't meant to be revisited. Some places bury themselves so you can keep moving. But the world outside the forest had no intention of letting her move quietly. The moment she returned to town, everything began to unravel. It started small, just a sense that people were watching her longer than usual. Neighbors paused mid-conversation when she walked past. The man at the gas station where she'd worked the night shift avoided eye contact. And outside the grocery store, 2 unfamiliar SUVs idled with tinted windows, the engines humming low like something waiting to pounce. Liam clung to her hand tighter each time someone glanced their way. Children feel shifts long before adults admit them. By evening, the news had arrived, fast, loud, and distorted. A headline crawled across the local station screen. 3 men missing in Appalachian forest. Possible criminal investigation underway. Their faces flashed for a moment. Those same hunters who had stormed her inheritance like wolves scenting blood. The reporter didn't mention Darrow Corporation yet, but the tone was unmistakable. Suspicion, urgency, the kind of coverage that grows teeth. Then came the second blow, a voice message from an unknown number, the tone clipped and authoritative. Ms. Ellis, this is Special Agent Garner with the West Virginia Division of Investigations. We need to ask you some questions regarding your visit to the Rourke property last week. Please return our call immediately. Her blood went cold, so they knew she'd been there. The forest had swallowed the hunters, but the world outside had picked up their scent and traced it straight to her doorstep. People disappear in Appalachia every year. Lost hikers, illegal scavengers, prospectors chasing ghost mines. But 3 men in tactical gear missing at once? That wasn't a mystery. That was a federal problem. And federal problems always demand faces to blame. She paced her small living room, the cheap floorboards creaking under her unsteady steps. Liam sat on the couch, silent, hugging his inhaler. Mara tried to form a plan, lawyer up, pretend ignorance, disappear entirely. But poverty squeezes options out of people until escape becomes a fantasy. She couldn't run. She couldn't hide. She could barely afford groceries. And now the shadow of a corporation powerful enough to send armed men into the forest hovered like a hawk over her life. The following morning, the story hit regional news, And that's when the world started taking sides. On one side were the whispers that she was dangerous, that she knew something she shouldn't, that the forest was cursed, and she was the curse's messenger. Local gossip mutates faster than truth. People began crossing the street to avoid her. Parents pulled their kids closer. Rumors painted her as everything from a vengeful recluse to a thief. Some claimed she'd lured the men into the woods. Others said she'd inherited witch property, tapping into old Appalachian superstition as easily as lighting a match. But then came the other side, the part she didn't expect. A journalist named Camille Rhodes arrived in town, not from a local paper, from a national investigative outlet. She approached Mara gently, with none of the sharp edges the police carried. Camille didn't demand answers. She asked questions a human would ask, not a corporate puppet. "Your great-uncle's land has a long history," she said, notebook in hand, "and the Darrow family has an even longer one. If something happened out there, it might not be on your shoulders." The honesty in her voice struck a nerve. Camille explained that Darrow Corporation had been accused, repeatedly, of misconduct, land theft, environmental violations, and suppressing minors' rights dating back nearly a century. Records of missing workers, falsified deaths, buried injuries. Mara listened, stunned, feeling fragments of Samuel's journals aligning with the journalism being whispered to her now. The hunters hadn't been working alone. They were part of a machine far bigger and darker than she'd imagined. But the lesson embedded in this moment wasn't relief. It was recognition. When you stand near the truth, no matter how unwillingly, the world will either expose you or protect you, depending on who stands beside you. And sometimes, strangers offer more protection than the systems that claim to serve you. Camille's presence brought a strange sense of clarity, not safety. Mara knew better than to trust that. But clarity. A reminder that she wasn't just a witness to what had happened in the forest. She was now a piece of the evidence. And evidence doesn't get to choose whether it wants attention. The more she thought about the root dwelling, the more she realized the forest had made a choice, too. It had collapsed to erase its secrets, to bury the gold, to bury the deaths, to bury the truth Samuel had carried alone for decades. But in doing so, it had pushed the responsibility into her hands. That responsibility now had a spotlight on it. By the week's end, reporters began knocking on her door. Police cruisers patrolled her street without explanation. Darrow representatives quietly asked mutual acquaintances about her. Liam's school called to ask whether he was emotionally stable enough to continue attending. And Mara understood with sinking clarity that the world was about to twist the story in whatever direction made the most powerful people comfortable. But she also understood another truth, one Samuel had whispered through his journals. Truth that stays buried becomes rot. Truth that surfaces becomes change. She sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she had once cried over bills and inhalers and hopelessness. But this time, her posture was different. She wasn't collapsing, she was bracing, not for the fallout, but for the fight. Because the world was coming for answers, and she would have to decide whether to hide or finally tell everything she knew. In the weeks that followed the investigation, the missing men, and the collapse of the root dwelling, Mara's life didn't return to normal, because normal was no longer possible. Something had shifted in her, in the town, and in the land itself. The truth had surfaced, loudly and publicly, and like anything dragged into daylight after decades in the dark, it carried consequences that spread far beyond the forest ridge. Darrow Corporation found itself facing a storm of lawsuits, inquiries, and renewed scrutiny from journalists like Camille Rhodes, who refused to let the story fade. The world didn't know everything, not the breathing walls, not the living roots, not the forest swallowing violence whole, but it knew enough to demand accountability. And in the middle of all of it stood Mara, not because she wanted to be a symbol, but because she didn't have another choice. One morning, as she sat across from Camille in a small diner in town, her hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug, Camille slid a folder toward her. "There's a federal restitution fund forming," she said quietly, "for communities harmed by Darrow's operations. And there's something else. You're listed as the legal trustee of the land your uncle protected. If you're willing, you could direct how that restitution is used." The words felt unreal. Mara, who had spent her whole life scraping by, suddenly being told she had influence. She blinked. "You mean I get to decide where the money goes?" Camille nodded. "You get to decide how the land heals, and how the people heal too." Healing wasn't a word Mara had ever applied to herself. Healing was something other people did in therapy offices she couldn't afford. But the land, what was left of Samuel's sanctuary, deserved more than justice. It deserved restoration. And so did the town. Ashford Ridge had suffered under the weight of poverty, pollution, mining dust, broken lungs, broken families. It needed more than another hearing or settlement. It needed a foundation, something rooted in truth, something built to last. And so the idea was born, not from ambition, but from responsibility. Mara gathered local volunteers, community leaders, environmental advocates, retired miners, and young people who believed the region could become something more than a place corporations extracted from and abandoned. In an old, unused school gym that smelled faintly of chalk and mildew, she made the announcement, "The Rourke Ellis Restoration Trust, a nonprofit dedicated to reforesting damaged land, funding health care for families affected by mining diseases, providing scholarships to children in the region, and restoring the sacredness of spaces that had been stripped bare." Some in the crowded room cried. Some crossed their arms skeptically, but most leaned forward as if hearing, for the first time, a future that didn't sound like despair. The first project was rebuilding part of the route, sanctuary, the surface level area where the dwelling once breathed. They didn't try to recreate the underground rooms. Some things weren't meant to be rebuilt. Instead, they created a sanctuary above ground, a circle of benches carved from fallen Appalachian timber, a small meditation path lined with ferns and local wildflowers, a central monument made of reclaimed wood from the collapsed roots, polished and sealed, but left natural enough that you could still trace the grooves where the forest had once moved, like muscle. A plaque engraved with Samuel's words, "The earth remembers, we forget, so let this place remind us." People from town came hesitantly at first, curiosity outweighing fear. But when they saw the sunlight filtering through the trees, the quiet peace that hung in the air, the feeling of safety that wrapped around the space like a warm blanket, they returned. Some prayed, some cried, some simply breathed easier. Healing doesn't always happen in hospitals. Sometimes it happens in places where the land finally has room to breathe with you. The trust grew slowly, then suddenly. A regional grant, donations from environmental groups, volunteers who had once felt forgotten by the world. Even Liam found his place in the sanctuary, helping plant seedlings, learning their names, asking questions about how roots communicate underground. He seemed lighter here, his breath steadier, his laughter easier. Maybe the land wasn't just healing, maybe it was giving something back. Through all of it, Mara learned a truth she'd never expected. You don't need wealth to build something lasting. You need intention. You need people. You need the courage to stand where the ground has broken before and plant something new. The forest had shown her what resilience looked like. Quiet, strong, unyielding. And now, for the first time, she felt herself mirroring that same strength, but healing, like roots, grows in unexpected directions. And just when she thought she understood what the trust was becoming, Camille approached her with a new document. One final extension of Samuel's legacy that neither of them had anticipated. A sign that the story wasn't finished, not for the land, not for the truth, and certainly not for Mara. Mara returned to the sanctuary on a gray autumn morning, the kind where the sky hangs low and quiet, as if the clouds themselves are pausing to inhale. In her hands, she carried the envelope Camille had given her, a weathered, brittle document pulled from the archives of an old county office, sealed and forgotten for decades. It was Samuel's final addendum to his will, dated the winter before he died, written in careful penmanship that wavered only at the edges. But it wasn't the words that pulled Mara back to the forest that day. It was the feeling, the sense that something unfinished waited there among the roots, soft as a whisper, but persistent as a heartbeat. The sanctuary was empty when she arrived. The benches glistened with morning dew. The trees, dressed in fading gold and rust-red leaves, rustled with a kind of gentle expectancy. She walked the winding gravel path slowly, letting each step anchor her in the moment. For the first time in years, she wasn't rushing. She wasn't bracing for the next crisis or calculating how many hours she needed to work to keep the lights on. She wasn't surviving. She was simply here. She reached the center stone, the one carved from the salvaged roots, and sat down. The forest hummed around her, a soft pulse of sound that felt almost familiar now. She opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed at the edges. At the top was Samuel's handwriting, "For the one who carries the burden after me." Mara exhaled, the words sinking into her chest like warm water. She read slowly, every sentence steady as a heartbeat. Samuel wrote about legacy, not the kind shaped from money or achievements, but the quiet, invisible kind, built from intention. He wrote about the debt owed to the land, the responsibility to heal what others had harmed, the courage it takes to choose restoration over revenge. And then, near the end, he wrote something that made her close her eyes and breathe deeply. The root remembers those who listen. The land trusts those who return what was taken. And the future belongs to those who choose to plant instead of bury. For a moment, Mara felt like she could hear him, his voice carried on the wind, old and steady, speaking to her not as a burden bearer, but as a partner in a story much larger than either of their lives. All her struggle, all the nights she lay awake, praying her son's lungs would hold out until morning. All the moments when the world felt too heavy. Somehow they led her here, to a place where grief and hope wove themselves into something stronger. She looked up at the canopy and realized something quietly profound. The sanctuary wasn't Samuel's legacy alone. It was hers. It was Liam's. It was every person in the community who had planted a tree, built a bench, carried lumber, shown up, believed. Legacies aren't handed down. They're grown, watered by the choices we make long after we think our role is finished. Mara stood and walked toward the old wooden marker at the far edge of the sanctuary. Liam had carved it just last summer, a place where the land and the people healed together. She touched the grain of the wood, feeling its warmth beneath her palm. Healing. That was the word that threaded through every step of this journey. More than treasure, more than justice, more than survival. Healing was the quiet revolution, the legacy capable of outliving greed. A group of school children arrived then, led by a young teacher who waved to her warmly. The kids scattered along the path, their laughter echoing like wind chimes. One little girl knelt by the roots of a newly planted sapling and whispered something to it, as if telling the tree a secret. And Mara felt something inside her soften, the good kind of ache, the kind that comes from knowing the world might just be okay after all. As she watched the children explore, she understood the final lesson Samuel had tried to leave her. What we build in the world is temporary, but what we nurture, what we protect, what we choose to return, those become the echoes that outlive us. The earth remembers. The roots remember. And now, the people remember too. As the morning sun finally broke through the clouds, casting warm light through the branches, Mara stepped back from the sanctuary and whispered, not to Samuel, not to the past, but to the land itself. Thank you. I'll keep listening. And with that, the story didn't end. It simply rooted itself deeper into the soil, into the community, into Liam's future, and into the quiet, powerful truth that the richest legacies are the ones that teach us how to care for something larger than ourselves. If this journey moved you, reflect on the places that shaped you, what they took from you, what they gave you, and what you can now return. And if you believe stories like this matter, share it, let it grow, and let it remind someone else that healing is its own kind of treasure.